Story 1. The Man Who Wouldn't Leave. There are nights that feel off the moment they begin. Not because anything obviously terrible happens right away, but because something deep inside you whispers that the world around you has shifted just slightly out of place. You can't point to it. You can't explain it to anyone. You just feel it, like a hand pressing lightly on your chest. Like the air itself has changed its composition by some fraction of a degree. This was one of those nights. It was a Tuesday in late October. I had just finished a double shift at the restaurant where I work downtown, and I was beyond exhausted. Not just tired, the kind of hollowed-out, bone-deep worn through that comes from 10 hours on your feet, carrying plates and forcing smiles and absorbing the small frustrations of other people's evenings. My feet ached. My lower back had gone from a dull throb to something sharper. All I wanted was to get home, stand in a hot shower until the water ran cold, and collapse into bed. I missed the last bus by about 4 minutes. I watched it pull away from the curb just as I came around the corner, brake lights flaring red in the dark like a small mockery. And I stood there for a second, recalculating. The next one wouldn't come for another 40 minutes. I stood at the stop for maybe 30 seconds before I decided I didn't want to wait. I decided to walk. The route home was 1.5 miles, mostly through streets I knew well. I'd walked it before, dozens of times, in all kinds of weather, at all kinds of hours. Nothing had ever happened. It was just a city at night, a little quieter than usual, a little emptier, but fundamentally the same city it always was. The streets were almost empty that late. A few cars drifted past at intervals, their headlights sweeping across the pavement. The occasional dog barked somewhere behind a fence, a distant bark that seemed absorbed by the dark almost immediately. The air had that cold, particular smell that October nights carry. Wet leaves and concrete and something else, something harder to name, like the season itself was decomposing slightly. I pulled my jacket tighter and kept moving. About 8 blocks from home, I passed a corner laundromat that was closed, but still had its fluorescent lights burning inside. I always found that place a little unsettling. All those machines sitting still and silent in the harsh light, like a room full of things waiting to be switched back on, patient in a way that objects shouldn't be patient. I'd passed it 100 times. That night, I registered it and kept moving. That's when I saw him. He was standing across the street, not walking toward anything, not waiting at a corner for a light to change, not checking a phone, not leaning against a building, just standing on the edge of the sidewalk, facing in my general direction. He was wearing a dark jacket, maybe navy or black, difficult to tell under the streetlights, and I couldn't make out his face clearly from that distance. He was just a figure, a shape in the dark that happened to be person-shaped. I noticed him the way you notice something that's just slightly wrong. Not an alarm, not a scream. More like a wrong note in a piece of music you know so well that the wrongness registers before your brain has consciously identified it. I kept walking. I told myself it was nothing. People stand on sidewalks. People exist at night. I wasn't the only person in the world who sometimes found themselves standing still on a corner, lost in thought, looking at nothing in particular. But then I turned left onto the next block and, a few seconds later, I heard footsteps behind me. I didn't stop. I didn't speed up. I just listened, the way you listen when something you don't want to think about forces itself into your attention anyway. The footsteps were steady, unhurried, but they maintained the exact same distance behind me no matter how I adjusted my pace. When I slowed almost imperceptibly, they slowed. When I walked slightly faster, they seemed to match without any apparent effort, as though the gap between us was fixed, rigid, like a thing that could not be changed. I crossed the street mid-block, something I don't normally do, a decision that served no practical purpose except to see what would happen. I glanced back as casually as I could manage, the way you might glance back if you just remembered you left something. It was him. Same dark jacket, same unhurried posture, like a person who has nowhere to be, and therefore cannot be made to hurry. My heart was moving faster now. I ran through the rational explanations the way you do. Same general direction. Coincidence. He lives somewhere along this route. He's walking home just like me. All of them perfectly plausible. All of them the kind of thing you'd tell yourself. But something in the quality of the silence between us felt intentional, in a way I couldn't rationalize away. Like he wasn't going somewhere. Like I was the destination. I took a sudden right turn down a street that led away from my apartment. A deliberate detour. A test. If this was coincidence, he would keep going straight. He had no reason to follow me onto a street that led nowhere useful. He turned. I want to be careful here about what I'm claiming. He never ran. He never shouted anything at me. He never made a threatening gesture or closed the distance between us at any point. He never did anything that would constitute a provable threat. And in a way, in a very specific, very uncomfortable way, that made it worse. Because I had no real basis to call for help. No one would have believed me. There's a man walking behind me. I could hear how that would sound to someone who wasn't living it. But I knew. Some part of me that operates below the level of conscious thought, below rationalization and self-reassurance, just knew that something was wrong with this. That the patience of it, the absolute unbroken patience, was not the patience of someone coincidentally going the same direction. It was something else entirely. I pulled out my phone. I called my roommate. I kept my voice steady, even casual, talked about nothing in particular, made it sound like a normal check-in call from someone walking home from a late shift. But I said his name slowly and clearly, and I told him the exact street I was on, and the cross street. He understood immediately, and said he'd stay on the line. I turned again, then again, onto another block that made no geographic sense as a route home. Each time, after a predictable few seconds, the footsteps came. He was never in a hurry. He never closed the gap between us. He followed with a patience that I can only describe as methodical, systematic, as though following me was a task he had committed to completing, and the timeline was entirely flexible. Finally, ahead of me, I saw the lights of a 24-hour convenience store. I pushed inside, went directly to the counter, and told the clerk quietly that someone was following me, and I needed to wait inside. He was a heavy-set man in his 50s with kind eyes, and the unhurried manner of someone who has worked nights long enough to have seen everything. He nodded once, leaned on the counter like nothing was happening, and said, "Stay as long as you need." I waited inside for over an hour. Through the window I could see the sidewalk outside. The man stood there for the first 20 minutes, a dark shape at the edge of the lamplight, not moving, not doing anything except being there. And then, at some point during my second cup of coffee from the machine by the door, he was gone. I took a different route home that night. A longer one, through better lit streets, past more people. I checked over my shoulder every 30 seconds for 8 blocks. I have never seen that man again. I still don't know who he was, or what he wanted, or whether he even knew himself what he intended to do if I'd simply kept walking and never gone inside. That uncertainty is what stays with me. Not the fear in the moment, but the fact that I will never know how that night was supposed to end. Story 2. The shortcut through the park. People say hindsight is 20/20, and that's true. But there's something particularly cruel about being able to identify the precise, unremarkable, ordinary-seeming decision that turned a normal evening into something you cannot shake. Not a dramatic choice. Not something that felt momentous at the time. Just a small, practical calculation about how to get from one place to another. For me, that decision was choosing to cut through the park. It was a Friday night in early spring, the kind of night that hasn't quite committed to being warm yet, when the air smells like thawing ground and the city feels like it's waking up from something. I'd been visiting a friend on the other side of the city, and I'd stayed too long, the way you do with good friends when the conversation keeps opening into new rooms. It was close to midnight when I left. I had 2 options: the long way around, through well-lit streets with traffic and the occasional open bar, or cutting through Raleigh Park, which would save me maybe 12 minutes. 12 minutes. That's what it came down to. I was tired, and the park felt familiar in the abstract. I'd been through it dozens of times in daylight. It was just a park, and I chose the shortcut. I stepped through the iron gate at the entrance and felt the city drop away behind me almost immediately. The change was instant and complete. The traffic sounds faded to almost nothing. The air was heavier in there, denser, weighted with the smell of wet bark and something faintly metallic I couldn't identify. The path ahead was lit by widely spaced lampposts, the kind that look reassuring in theory, but leave long, unlit stretches of pure dark between their pools of yellow light. The dark between them wasn't just dim. It was the kind of dark where your eyes work hard and still don't give you much. The park was officially closed after 10. I knew this, and I'd gone in anyway. I told myself I'd be through in a few minutes and no one would care. I was about halfway along the main path when I noticed the bench. It sat just at the reach of one of the lampposts, straddling the border between lit and unlit. Someone was sitting on it. A woman, I thought at first. Long dark hair, slight frame, positioned with her back mostly toward me as I approached. I noted her the way you note other people in a public space late at night, with a kind of peripheral awareness that doesn't quite cross into direct attention. I didn't want to make her uncomfortable by staring. I passed her at a normal walking distance, offered the small neutral acknowledgement you give to strangers, and kept going. She didn't move, didn't look up, didn't shift at all. Just sat there, completely and entirely motionless, her head angled slightly forward toward her lap. I had gone maybe 30 feet past her when I stopped. I'm not entirely sure why. It wasn't a sound or a detail I could consciously name. It was more like an absence. A gap where there should have been something. Some ambient sense of aliveness that the human body generates just by existing in a space. A subtle, continuous signal that she simply wasn't transmitting. I turned around slowly. She was still in exactly the same position. Hair hanging forward, hands folded in her lap. Not a single micro movement. None of the tiny postural adjustments that people make constantly without realizing. The small shifts of weight, the adjustments of balance. The kind of stillness you see in photographs. The kind of stillness you associate with things that are not alive. I took a few steps back toward her. "Hey," I said, keeping my voice even. "Are you okay?" Nothing. No response at all. "Excuse me. Are you all right?" And then she moved. But not the way a person moves when they've been sitting still and have just been brought back to the present by a voice. She moved the way something moves when it has been caught doing something it didn't want you to notice. There was a quality to it I still find very difficult to describe. A jerkiness, an abruptness, like something suddenly resuming after a pause. Her head came up and she looked directly at me. I wish I could describe what was wrong with that look in a way that would make sense to someone who wasn't there. Her eyes were open too wide. Not in fear or surprise. Those expressions have shapes you recognize, but simply too wide, as though the calibration was slightly off, as though the mechanism that governs how wide human eyes open had received the wrong parameters. She smiled, and the smile was wrong in the same way. Too broad. Held about 2 seconds too long after the appropriate moment for a smile to fade. And then she said nothing, just held the smile, held the too wide eyes, and looked at me without speaking. I said, "Sorry to bother you," in a voice that didn't quite sound like mine, and I turned around and walked. Fast, then faster. I was fighting the impulse to run because some irrational part of my brain had decided that running would confirm something I did not want confirmed. That there was a real reason to be afraid, that there was something to run from. As long as I was walking, I could still tell myself this was nothing. But then I heard her footsteps behind me. Quick, purposeful, and close. Far closer than they should have been for someone who had been sitting motionless on a bench 30 feet behind me just seconds ago. The speed of the transition, from absolute stillness to being almost right behind me, didn't make sense. I had maybe a second to process that before my body made the decision my brain was still hesitating over. I ran, hard, straight toward the gate at the far end of the park. Behind me I could hear her. Footsteps that were wrong in a way I still can't fully articulate. Irregular in a way that didn't quite match the rhythm of a person moving normally through space. Like the sound was slightly out of sync with what a person running should sound like. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see. I hit the gate at full speed, burst through it, stumbled onto the sidewalk outside, and kept running for another block before I stopped against a building and looked back. The gate was closed. The park was dark. Nothing had come through. I stood on that sidewalk with my hands on my knees, breathing hard, for a long time. A couple walked past and gave me the sideways look you give to someone who appears to be having some kind of episode on a public street. I probably looked exactly like that. I took the long route home. I have never taken that shortcut again. I've told myself 100 times since then that there's a rational explanation, that she was a person, perhaps unwell, perhaps frightened herself, reacting strangely in a strange situation. That explanation holds together reasonably well when I think about it in daylight. But at midnight, on that sidewalk, with my heart doing something that felt closer to a structural failure than a heartbeat, it did not feel like that. It did not feel like that at all. Story 3. The car that kept circling the app said 3 minutes, then 4, then it reset to 7, which is the app's way of admitting it doesn't actually know. I watched the little animated car icon crawl across the map in a direction that made no sense, looping around a block, doubling back, taking a left that led it further from me rather than closer. Then the ride cancelled. Driver unable to complete pickup. It was just past 1 a.m. I was standing outside a bar in a part of the city I didn't know well. My friends had piled into a cab 10 minutes earlier. There hadn't been room for all of us, and I'd said I'd get my own ride. It wasn't a problem. I'd be home in 20 minutes. The bar's awning gave me a strip of shelter. The street outside was quiet in a way that didn't feel peaceful. Quiet the way a room feels quiet when something has recently left it. My phone was at 22%. I requested another ride. Surge pricing had kicked in, 3 times the normal rate. I accepted it without hesitating. The new estimated arrival time was 9 minutes. 9 minutes is not a long time. I repeated this to myself. 9 minutes is nothing. I stood under the awning, scrolled through my phone, kept myself distracted. But the street did something during those 9 minutes, or I did. Some shift occurred that I can't entirely account for. The tiredness, the unfamiliar surroundings, the late hour. Whatever the cause, by the 5th or 6th minute I was paying more attention to the street than to my phone. Cataloging it. Reading it the way you read something when you're not entirely sure it's safe to stop reading. That's when I noticed the car. Dark-colored sedan. Nothing that should have registered. Not an unusual model. Not a color that stood out. Nothing modified or distinctive. I noticed it the first time it passed because it was moving slowly. Not suspiciously slowly. Not the crawl of someone looking for a specific address. Just noticeably below the speed you'd drive a mostly empty street at that hour. The windows were tinted dark enough that I couldn't see the driver at all. I glanced at it and looked back at my phone. The new driver was 6 minutes out. About 90 seconds later, the same car passed again. Same direction. Same slow, unhurried speed. I filed it in the part of my mind that was tracking things but not yet concerned about them. Lost driver. Looking for parking. Waiting for someone. All fine. All normal. Then it passed a third time. And this time it slowed down more, noticeably, deliberately more, as it passed the spot where I was standing. Not to a stop, but slow enough that there was no question it was registering me specifically. Slow enough that the slowing itself was a communication. I kept my eyes down, on my phone, but I watched. The car kept going, turned at the far corner, and disappeared. My second driver cancelled. Unable to reach pickup location, the app told me. 14% battery. I requested a third ride. 11 minutes estimated. I looked up at the bar. Staff were pulling chairs up onto tables inside, the lights already dimmer. It was clearly closing, and I didn't feel like being the person who knocked on a closed bar's door to ask to wait inside. I started walking. Not toward home. I had only a rough sense of which direction that was from here. But just along the street, because standing still felt suddenly like the wrong choice. Movement felt like control, like doing something rather than just being somewhere, waiting. I had been walking for perhaps 90 seconds when I heard the engine again. I knew it before I saw it. There was a very slight roughness to the idle that I had registered at some level without consciously noting it the first few times. I kept walking without looking back. The car fell in behind me, matching my pace. A walking speed. Slow and steady and close. Every rational part of me was still generating explanations. Coincidence. Someone driving slowly because they're on their phone. Someone who happens to be going this direction at this speed. But the explanations felt thinner this time. less convincing. They had the hollow quality of things you say to yourself when you're working hard not to believe what you actually believe. I turned left suddenly. No gradual shift, no telegraphing, just an immediate sharp left into a side street. And then I stopped instantly, pressing myself against the wall just around the corner, and waited. For a moment, nothing. The street I'd turned onto was empty and quiet. Then I heard the car slow. Stop. The engine ran at idle, sitting right there at the corner. Not moving. Just idling. Just waiting. For what felt like a very long time. I pulled out my phone. 10%. I called 911, gave the cross streets, described the car as precisely as I could. Dark sedan, tinted windows, no plate I'd managed to catch. The dispatcher was calm and efficient in the way that 911 dispatchers are trained to be when someone is scared and needs a steady voice more than anything else. She said a unit would be by in a few minutes and told me to stay on the line and stay where I was. The car sat at that corner for another minute or so. And then, slowly, not in a panic, not quickly, just in the same unhurried way it had done everything else that night, it pulled away. I listened to the engine fade down the block, and then it was gone. A police car arrived less than 5 minutes later. 2 officers, calm and professional. They drove me around the nearby blocks twice. We didn't find the sedan. They took my description and my phone number, said they'd keep an eye out, told me to get home safely. I got home safely. I locked the door. I sat on my couch for a while, not ready to sleep, running through it. The 3 passes, the slowdown, the way it had idled at that corner, just out of sight, as though thinking. There is no clean ending to this story. There is no resolution. I don't know who was driving that car, or what they wanted, or whether anything would have happened if I hadn't turned when I did. I don't know if I saved myself from something or just frightened myself on a late night in an unfamiliar neighborhood. That uncertainty is the part I've never been able to put down. Every time I stand on a street corner after midnight now, I notice every slow-moving car, every single one. I track them the way I used to track nothing, because nothing used to require tracking. I don't know if that's paranoia or wisdom. I've started to think maybe there's less distance between those 2 things than I ever used to believe. These stories don't have clean endings. The man was never identified. The woman in the park was never explained. The car was never found. And that, more than anything else, is what makes the night feel dangerous. Not what you can see, but everything you can't. If any of this felt too familiar, if you've had a night that moved like one of these, then you already know what I'm talking about. The street at night is a different world, and some of the people who move through it don't want to be seen.